So when we talk about media relations, public relations and what I do, what different forms does it take? Well, I can get a cold call from a journalist saying about this, these words that are at the Gold Coast board that we had a bit of a controversy a little bit last year that was misinterpreted the wrong way. It was meant to be some sort of inspirational words, but it was just misconstrued by the media. I do quite a few media releases when we've got things to announce. Bishop John Roundhill last year when he was appointed, that's obviously a big news thing. Wouldn't be doing media releases every couple of weeks, but that is something that I traditionally try and use as a proactive tactic, or just picking up the phone to a journalist, pitching a story to a journalist individually. Having been in the media for the best part of almost 30 years, I've still got lots of media contacts. It is a changing landscape, but I will pitch stories to journalists, video media releases. We might put video out of events that we do on occasions with the ordination. Last year we had a wonderful story out last year with Rosemary Gardner and her mother, sort of two generations of female reverends. So if we've got a good news story to tell, we don't shoot a lot of video, so it's a bit hard for me to make any commitment to coming out of video events. But if you've got something significant happening and you've got the capacity for somebody to be able to film it, if it's got colour, movement and an interesting story behind, give me a call. We can talk about getting some local media coverage for you with that. Social media, it's a whole world out there. I guess different capacities and levels of expertise that you have. We do have the Facebook page for Anglican Church Southern Queensland. Mostly Focus content from the Focus magazine goes out through there. If we were a better resource, we'd love to do more. We'd love to do more on Insta and Twitter, but they are a little bit perilous if you can't do them properly. So we try and keep it fairly straightforward with Facebook posts, and we get reasonably good engagement there. And I know a lot of you have got your own pages and websites, so keep doing the good work there. Pretty symbiotic relationship at times with the media. I mean, newsrooms generally are staffed leaner and meaner than what they used to be. So if I can talk to a journalist and provide them with a good news story, they're happy to do that. And I put my old journalist hat on. I think like a journalist, I write like a journalist. And there's a number of times where I've written a media release, but I've written it as a news story and it's appeared word for word in the local newspaper. That's great for us. Because if we've got, and I'll supply a good photo, so it's doing the newspaper editor a favour or the TV chief of staff if we provide some interesting content and a good story to tell. Just want to talk a little bit about this. Does anyone remember or see this last year where we had the story of Proston? One of the, I can't remember what district it's in, but I walked into the job and there'd been some media coverage. What's the date on that? 2015. So what it was the Proston Church, which had, pretty much a non-existent congregation. So the church was being closed, it had to be deconsecrated. But there was a bit of a challenge there because, just to read this, for close to 80 years, the body of reclusive Queensland Gracie was presumed buried inside the church. And he'd bequested money for the original church to be built back in the, I've got the media release here, so he died in 1935. Charles Shepherd was the name of the fellow. So long story short, the challenge that we had there was we were going to sell the church, but before we deconsecrated the church, we had to solve the mystery of where was the body or the remains of this fellow, Charles Shepherd. So the property team were working through that. It had already made the news in 2015, and basically the story was saying, church loses body. Not a particularly good story back then. My predecessor had media managed that, but I was coming in at a different phase where it was well known in the local community. We couldn't hide the fact that we were going to be doing a service with Bishop Cam Venables of deconsecrating the church. The local community knew, but I thought, well, let's turn this into a positive, because what we'd done in the meantime was we'd used ground penetrating radar to identify that the remains of Charles Shepherd was actually in a particular spot underneath a church. So it's kind of church finds body was the good news story, and that we were going to respectfully and around proper sort of protocol move the remains of that of the grazier whose money had helped build the church into the local cemetery. So I put out a media release on that, the headline says, "Remains of grazier exhumed while solemn reburial lays mystery to rest." An 83-year-old mystery was laid to rest today with the exhumation of the remains of grazier Charles Shepherd from St Peter's Anglican Church, Proston, before being reinterred in the Proston Cemetery near Kingaroy. So that service, that solemn ceremony had to happen. There was no need, there was no point in trying to pretend people wouldn't hear about it locally. So I said, let's make a positive story out of this. That story that I wrote, that sort of 1.5 page media release, pretty much got run word for word in the local paper there. We provided a couple of photos. Well, the community had an interest over years. Sorry, I should have gone through this slide first. They wanted to make sure we were doing the right thing, and we were very committed to doing the right thing about identifying the remains under the church, spending the money with ground penetrating radar. And as I say, advanced planning for the media coverage. I did that in consultation with Bishop Cam and the property team, and organised for, I think it was Nicole Ham from the property team was out there overseeing the logistics, if you like, of all of this reinterment, and she was also involved in the liaison with the local property agent who would be listing and selling the church. And I think we're close to signing the contract, or have signed a contract there to sell that. So we actually took the photos, I supplied the photos and the story to the local paper, and we ended up getting a good news story out of it locally. Might have run in Brisbane Times, but it was mostly for local media. ABC Radio, I think, did a story as well. I just want to talk to you a little bit about this one. I don't know if anyone's in that neck of the woods. St Luke's Theatre Society at Eckersley. Anyone know about the fact that the Theatre Society has been operating out of our parish hall at St Luke's for many years? So what happened with this? The first, I'm not even sure if I was brought in by the property team to the fact that we were planning a redevelopment at St Luke's at Eckersley. They've got so many projects on the go, and I guess they come and talk to me. We've got a better understanding now that they'll give me a heads up if there's any hint of anything on the horizon. But it was kind of, we got the curveball when I get a call from a local journalist saying St Luke's, and this was the editor of the local Quest newspapers. So it wasn't Today's Show or 60 Minutes, but still had the potential to do damage locally, and I'll step you through that in a minute. But the journalist rings me, the editor, and says, well, your community's up in arms, parishioners aren't happy, St Luke's Theatre Society isn't happy, you guys haven't been consulting with them. So I go talk to the property team and say, guys, tell me about the project, what have we been doing? Long story short, look, I think their consultation in the parish, in the community, and with a key stakeholder, a hall renter at the end of the day, the Theatre Society, but a long-term tenant, have been reasonably good, and I think we got blindsided a little bit by maybe the internal communication within the St Luke's Theatre Society, and one or two people trying to wield their power to make sure they got a better result out of what we were proposing to do in knocking the hall down, building a new one, giving them a different facility. Okay, they were going to have to find new digs for 10 months while all this happened. So what happens is the local councillor gets involved. He sees votes and a bit of I'm standing up and fighting for my local community, political capital in this, and ropes in a lady from the local theatre society who was, I think, quite frankly, almost the sole agitator, and a Labor candidate, not even another local member, a Labor candidate for the adjoining council ward. So this became very political. You might think, well, big deal, what does it matter? Well, it really threatened to torpedo this property project for the St Luke's parish. because what happened then was, as I say, the local councillor got involved. It's in the local newspapers. We just had a new Lord Mayor in Adrian Schrinner, a new Deputy Lord Mayor, Krista Adams, voted in. Krista Adams, her ward adjoins St Luke's. The boundaries have just been redrawn, so I think before the redraw of the last month or two, that was in her parish. So she's saying, well, what's all this about? The local Labor councillor jumps up in a council meeting, and whereas I was being informed I didn't think there were necessarily any heritage issues that would stop us progressing with the project, he invokes this thing called a temporary land planning order, maybe it should be TLPO, but it was a blocking motion in council. So before we knew it, the new Deputy Mayor was saying, you're creating a political headache for me. Don't think you're going to get this project through, even though this is what they call code accessible. So we didn't have to do the full community engagement thing. So what looked on the surface, like a multi, $1.2 million project or something like that, very important for St Luke's for their future viability. The other piece in the jigsaw, I should say, they were building a childcare centre there. The part of the project is to build a childcare centre. So that project, through a bit of political grandstanding, some community engagement that in hindsight could have been done a little bit better, stakeholder management, the whole thing has been sort of delayed for 6 months. I organised a meeting with the Deputy Mayor and the parish council and the property team, so we could sit down, nut out what the key issues were from a political perspective even, really, with the Deputy Mayor. We're still working through those issues, but it has created a bit of a problem for that project. So I'll just give you a little bit of information around that. That may be a bit unique. I hope we haven't got another 10 of these festering out there in the diocese. But I know there are a number of other parishes and projects where there's heritage issues involved. So if you've got something that's a bit complicated, I probably would know about it through the property team, but happy for you to pick up the phone if you think there's community issues that we can talk through. Plans by Anglicare to do a retirement village at the site of Loader House also caused us a bit of grief last year, and that also became very political. So in the aftermath of that, trying to manage the stakeholders with clear communication, just working out what these issues were from the perspective of the Deputy Mayor. We had a follow-up meeting about 3 weeks ago with the local Labor candidate. There was another project in his ward which we needed to talk him through. So having those face-to-face meetings with the politicians, particularly at this time of year, or this time of the political cycle, when we've got council elections due in March next year, they really appreciate that personal engagement. They couldn't help themselves, the politicians, saying, well, you didn't consult very well, wanted to give us a backhander. We did say, well, we thought we were doing okay, but you're entitled to your view. But if they think they can garner votes in it, they're going to use that for their own political advantage. And we're still working through those issues at St Luke's there. Something that's coming up, just a bit of an example where I'm working with parishes to try and help them progress a property project, and there's a good news story to tell. So the guys up there are looking at a new multi-purpose community hall. I think, it's $1 million. They're still in fundraising mode. But I was approached on the basis that we got an old hall. We're trying to fundraise for this new project. ANFIN's going to loan us some money, but there's still a bit of a gap there. So we want to get a bit of publicity around this. Now, to the point made earlier in the day that publicity doesn't necessarily get you funds, but I think what it can do is at least lift a bit of a profile for you, create some community awareness of what you're doing. So every Wednesday night for over 10 years at the St Peter's Hall up there, they've been running meals for the homeless. So I'm working with them. We were going to do a story with local media probably about 2 months ago, and then a few other ducks just needed to get to be lined up once we talked it through. So we're holding off on that story. But what I've done in the meantime is say to the guys up there, okay, well look, I need a story behind the story. What are we doing here? Tell me a bit about your volunteers. Tell me a bit about, if you can give me a bit of a human face to some of the beneficiaries. So obviously they do this respectfully with particularly any of the homeless people, and some of them might be a bit, you know, embarrassed about their predicament. But there's 2 people and they've got their permission to share their story. So I've got that information just sitting in an email there. You know, one of the guys has got a really interesting story to tell. You know, the fact that he's homeless isn't really his fault. But he's happy to, in a sense, you know, praise the virtues of the, you know, the social connection, the benefit. I think he's been coming for a couple of years. You know, something he looks forward to every Wednesday night. I can make a story out of that with either the local TV news or the local Sunshine Coast Daily. So, you know, it doesn't need to be a world-beating story. It needs a personal touch. It needs, you know, a human face to these things a lot of the time. So happy for you to give me a call, drop me an email, or talk to me if you think there's an element to some community work you're doing, or something that can lay the foundation with community work that you're doing. Rod and I are going to have a chat around their opening of their next op shop. But what I've said to Rod is just let's sort of, again, it's a little bit about, tell me a bit about one of the volunteers, or, you know, can we find, you know, maybe, just maybe there's a story that they might know about a guy who came in, bought a $30 suit because he didn't own a suit and he got a job out of it. You know, that's sort of, as we were talking before with Daniel, that's sort of the human impact. What I say to people in the media, look, it's mostly bad news, but in every news web page, website, news bulletin, there's always room for sort of that feel-good 10% of good news stories, and why shouldn't we own a bit of a part of that? So don't be negative and think that the media is not interested in good news. There is a small space for that, and we can help own that. So any questions on that media, community, PR side of things? I'm just going to talk a little bit about, for the last 10 minutes, political engagement as we come into that election season. Okay, yep, sure.
Are you available to advise us in sort of fundraising activities, policy or publicity strategy, framing of advertisements and press releases?
Press releases, yeah. Advertisements probably not my bag. But if you've got a project, you know, we can have a general chat around some different ideas there. So yeah, certainly happy to help you in that regard. I will have expertise probably in, you know, a majority of that. There might be other things, and I say, oh, that's really a marketing thing. And I think we're waiting to fill the marketing position in the diocese. But yeah, happy to go offline and chat about that in the coming weeks. All right, look, just for those that weren't aware, I mean, as we were talking before, you all have your own local community engagement. I'm sure you do it very well, but just look for those touch points. As we were saying before, I feel like this has probably been said a little bit better by the previous speakers, but we need to maintain that relevance and that engagement. And you know your parishes and your local communities better. Some great advice there from Rod and Daniel and Dominique around knowing what the need is in your area. So I guess that's all I'm trying to achieve there. You know, I've used media stories in the past. If there's a need for volunteers or something like that, you might find you're lacking in volunteers. Well, you know, maybe we can find a little story that appears in the local paper there. A little bit of the anecdotal stuff we've heard earlier about the benefit of why people volunteer. I guess you all know that pretty well. You're volunteers in your own right, so we know the benefits there. But if you're finding, for example, you know, your volunteers are dropping off, maybe we can look at doing a little bit of a story there. And again, I'd look to personalise that. You know, everyone's got a story to tell. It's just a matter of them being willing to share it for the benefit of your parish, and happy to help you to work through that. So I guess just a little bit of a checklist on community engagement. You may do this already, but where are there opportunities? What are the issues that resonate in your area? We've been through the federal election. We're coming up to council and state elections next year. Some parishes engage really well with their local politicians and local business and community leaders. If you don't, you probably need to come up with a bit of a list before, as I think Everell said at the start of the day. The days of the big wealthy business individuals being immersed in the church aren't as good as they used to be, but maybe there's a way that you can make contact with them. They may not particularly be people of faith, but if you're running community services, there may be a connection there. There could be a partnership, there could be a collaboration. Most corporations these days, most businesses are looking to tick a bit of a box on that corporate social responsibility. So don't underestimate the value of partnering with organisations, businesses in your area, and think that there can't be something complementary for both of you. So council elections in March next year, and we do know the date of that, March 28, and now because the law's changed around state elections, it's fixed 4-year terms, so we know October 31 next year is going to be the state election. Adrian Schrinner, Rod Harding, maybe. You've been reading in the media this week. I think only 2 people out of 100 could identify Rod Harding as the Labor Lord Mayoral candidate. So there could be a third mystery person who comes in and ends up leading the Labor Party. But we do know we're going to have local government elections and state elections next year. So why is that relevant for you? Well, politicians want votes. Politicians want to engage with local communities at this time of the year. So if you don't know who your local candidate is, if you don't know who your local member is, both council and state, now's a good time to get to know them. What can they do for you? What can you do for them? It never hurts to start the conversation. I'm not talking about blatant sort of, if you can organise a grant for us, we're going to get people to vote for you. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. Donald Trump can do deals like that, but and isn't that fascinating at the moment? But that whole sort of, era when politicians would seek to, work with their local communities, they're probably a little more wary these days about their intentions being seen as, dishonest or insincere. But get to know them, talk to them, see what the key issues for them are coming up to, and talk to both sides. Don't just talk to the incumbent. So I probably can't give you, any sort of political strategy around that, but I just wanted you to think about the timing if you weren't aware. So, and everything gets very political. The reference before to those other projects at Eckersley and Sunshine Coast, I mean, things, projects going through the normal approval process end up getting caught up in the politics of it if the local candidate or the local member thinks it could either gain them votes or lose them votes or creates a bit of a political headache. And quite frankly, for Krista Adams, as the LNP member for the area, she was quite blunt with us and saying, well, if you're going to cause me a political headache, I won't support this project through council, and you better park it until the elections are over. Come back and talk to me then. I mean, I appreciated the frankness because I was pretty sure that's what was driving it. But that's the reality, that some projects in the property space are going to be caught up in the timing of politics in terms of that regard. I know some people understand politics better than others, but just be clear that, there are, areas of responsibility for council, state and Commonwealth. So things like refugees, asylum seekers, that whole sort of realm, that's pretty much Commonwealth. The state's is going to look after health, education, environment in the large part. I guess the old roads, rates and rubbish is local issues when it comes to council. But if you're not clear on whether you've got a local issue, Bronwyn mentioned me before, some issues around concerns out around Ipswich Way and sort of, dumping of toxic material in the area. That's a local council issue that may sort of tip over into state environment responsibilities as well. So, sorry? Right, okay, there you go. So you might get a bit of grey area or crossover sometimes in some of those particular issues. But see if you can trawl around websites if you're unclear, if there's a particular local issue for you that's important for whatever reason. Maybe it's something you want to, it's of concern to your local community and you think there can be some grounds for community engagement there. So it'll be different areas of responsibility for those three tiers of government in that regard. And I guess what I'm saying, to reinforce the point, build relationships now. I mean, I guess we're only 6 months out from a council election, a bit further from a state election, but if you think there's some value in talking to your local politician, start talking to them now. Most candidates should be in place for state elections. Sometimes some of those might be a little bit earlier next year.